All right, so we're diving into something I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. Those times when you're looking at your CGM and just like, what is going on with these readings? They're all over the place.
Yeah,
You think you're hydrated, you think you're doing everything right, and numbers just don't make sense.
right.
So we're going to go beyond just the surface level advice and really try to unpack CGM accuracy, hydration, and everything in between.
Yeah, it's interesting because hydration is often presented as kind of like the solution to all CGM woes, but in reality, it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Totally. And to get that well-rounded perspective, we're going to tap into a few different sources today. We've got some real-world experiences from a diabetes subreddit thread, scientific research on water intake and blood sugar, and even a study on how people perceive CGM accuracy.
Ooh, I like that mix, getting the practical and the more scientific.
Exactly. So let's just jump right into that Reddit thread because there's just something about hearing from people who are actually living with us every single day. There's a certain wisdom there.
Mm,
One user said, and I quote, "As someone who experiences this issue nearly every sensor session and is well hydrated 2-3 fluids day, I am baffled."
yeah.
I mean, that is so relatable.
Mm.
But what really caught my eye were the solutions that people were suggesting. And some of them, let me tell you, went way beyond drink more water.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to see how people kind of troubleshoot on their own and they come up with sometimes some really innovative solutions.
Right, like this whole idea of compression affecting readings,
Oh.
especially if you're a side sleeper.
Hmm.
Like I never thought about how I sleep could impact my CGM.
Yeah, and it makes sense when you think about how CGMs actually work. They're measuring glucose in interstitial fluid,
Right.
which is the fluid that's surrounding your cells, not directly in your blood. So anything that kind of messes with the flow of that fluid, like compression from lying on the sensor, can throw things off.
So it's not just like how much fluid you're taking in, but how that fluid's moving around your body.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of sensor placement.
Right.
Users in the thread were talking about scar tissue being too close to bone or muscle. It's like finding the right spot for your CGM is an art form in itself.
Truly. It's like finding that sweet spot.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole restart hack that people are
Mm.
talking about. One user even went into detail about how they do it. It's basically like extending the life of their sensor.
Oh, wow.
Pretty ingenious, right?
Yeah, that's a great example of how people are becoming more tech savvy and, they're really trying to get the most bang for their buck.
Yeah.
But it's also important to highlight that there are some risks involved.
Of course.
When you start kind of messing with the intended function of the sensor, you could actually be compromising its accuracy
Right.
or even damaging it.
Good point. So a little word of caution if you're thinking about going down that road.
Okay.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the science behind all of this.
Mm-hmm.
We found this research paper from 2011 that digs into the relationship between water intake and blood sugar, and it had some pretty interesting findings.
Yeah.
What did you think?
Yeah, well, they found that higher water intake was linked to a lower risk of hyperglycemia.
Interesting.
And that makes sense, right? When you think about how hydration affects that glucose concentration in your body. I mean, think about it this way. The more water you drink, the more diluted that glucose becomes in your bloodstream.
Okay. So it's kind of like the water is helping to flesh out
Yeah.
the excess sugar. Is that kind of how it works?
Exactly. And not only does it like dilute it, but it also helps your body get rid of it through urine.
Okay.
So hydration is kind of helping in both areas there.
Okay. So hydration definitely has a role, but earlier you said it was just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
What are some of the other factors that are just as or even more important when we're thinking about blood sugar and CGM accuracy?
Well, I mean, we can't talk about blood sugar without talking about the big players here, right? Insulin, carbs, diet, exercise, those all have a way more significant impact on your glucose levels than just hydration alone.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's kind of like if you're trying to solve a puzzle, but you only have like one of the pieces, you need the whole picture. You need all the pieces, right?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand interstitial fluid.
Okay.
Remember, CGMs are measuring glucose indirectly through this fluid, so it's almost acting like a middleman between your blood sugar and the sensor readings.
So if we're dehydrated, there's less of that fluid, and that's what can throw off those readings.
Yeah, exactly. Dehydration can lead to those skewed readings, including those frustrating false lows that a lot of people get.
Ooh, yes.
So keeping yourself consistently hydrated is really important. It helps make sure there's enough of that interstitial fluid for the CGM to accurately measure your glucose levels.
Okay, that makes total sense. So that's the hydration piece. But I have to say what really caught my eye was this study on user perceptions of CGM systems.
Interesting.
You'd think that with all the technology we have today, accuracy wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, we could think so.
But this perceptions of continuous glucose monitoring system study, it really had some fascinating insights.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, they found that sensor-to-sensor accuracy can be really different.
Hmm.
Only 79% of users were satisfied with the performance right out of the box on day one.
Oh, wow. I would have thought that number would be way higher.
Me too. And get this, certain medications can actually interfere with the readings.
What?
I know. Things like acetaminophen
Okay.
and salicylic acid, common ingredients in painkillers.
Got it.
Those can actually affect how accurate the sensor is.
So, like, if I pop a Tylenol, that could mess with my CGM.
Possibly. And the study even went into detail about how they test these things.
Hmm.
They called them interference.
Okay.
They actually created this whole controlled environment in a lab to see how different substances interact with the CGM. It's pretty wild.
That's so interesting. So it's not just what's going on inside our bodies, but things we're putting into our bodies that can affect those readings, too.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, 42% of the users in the study actually believe that accuracy varies between sensors, even if they're from the same brand.
Oh, wow. So even if you find a brand you like, you might get a sensor that's just not as accurate.
It's like CGM roulette. You just never know what you're going to get.
Right. It really shows you just how much variability there is in the technology, even with all of the advancements that we have.
Yeah. So it really makes you think, how much can we actually rely on just the CGM data alone?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
we'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
Definitely makes me think twice about just trusting those numbers blindly.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many factors at play. It seems like context is really key here.
Absolutely. It sounds like we've given you kind of like a new way to look at your CGM data, like to recognize the potential that it has, but also its limitations.
Yeah, definitely. It's like I'm seeing my CGM in a whole new light. It's not like this all-knowing oracle.
Exactly. And so this kind of brings us back to that question that we've been talking about. How do we navigate this world of information overload? How do we make sense of all this, especially when it comes to something as personal as our health data?
So where do we even begin?
Yeah.
I'm a little overwhelmed right now just thinking about all these factors that go into CGM readings.
Well, I think a good first step is just to acknowledge that complexity.
Okay.
CGM data, it's influenced by so many things, and it's really easy to get lost in the weeds if we're trying to analyze like every single blip.
Yeah. So it's not about chasing perfect readings or freaking out over every spike and dip.
No, not at all. Remember that quote that we were talking about earlier from the Reddit thread?
Yeah.
Where the user was saying that they were baffled by the erratic readings even though they were staying hydrated? It's a good reminder that hydration is important,
Right.
but it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. And that user perception study really, really emphasized that point.
Yeah.
I mean, sensor variations, medications, even just how old the sensor is. All of those things can change the data.
Absolutely. And this is where I think critical thinking comes in. We have to move beyond just like blindly accepting the numbers that we see on the screen. We have to start asking ourselves some questions. What else could be contributing to these readings? What's the overall trend? How am I feeling physically?
It's like becoming a detective in a way.
Yeah.
Like piecing together all these clues to get that bigger picture.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge the assumptions. We always hear that more data is better, but in reality, I think it's the quality and the interpretation of that data that really, really matters.
So it's okay to question that data,
Mhm.
to check in with how I'm feeling, and to even talk to my doctor or my healthcare team if something seems off.
Oh, absolutely. You are the expert on your own body. Remember that. CGM data is a tool.
Okay.
It's there to inform your decisions. It's not the boss of you.
Okay, I like that.
Mhm.
So I'm starting to feel, I don't know, a little bit more empowered, a little less like I'm at the mercy of my CGM. But what about those alarms? Ugh, they can be both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Those alarms, they can be so helpful.
Yeah.
Sometimes they can be life-saving.
Right.
But as we saw from that study, they can also be super disruptive.
Yeah.
They can actually even negatively affect your diabetes management if they're not calibrated correctly.
So it's all about finding that balance, I guess.
Yeah.
Between being alerted to important changes, but also not being bombarded with constant notifications.
Exactly. And this is where customization is so powerful. Don't be afraid to really get in there and play with the alarm settings on your CGM.
Okay.
You have the power to decide what levels trigger an alert when those alerts are active.
So if I'm constantly waking up to a false low in the middle of the night, I can adjust it so that it's not going off during those hours.
Exactly. It's about making the technology work for you, not the other way around. And if you're ever unsure about how to do that, how to adjust those settings, your healthcare team, they can help you with that.
That makes sense.
Yep.
It's like tailoring a suit, right? You want it to fit you perfectly. You don't want to just buy something off the rack that isn't quite right.
I like that.
You know, I noticed it in that Reddit thread. A lot of people were talking about sensors falling off prematurely,
Oh, yeah.
which is so annoying. Any tips on how to prevent that?
Yeah, it's a common frustration.
Yeah.
But there are things you can do. Application is really key.
Okay.
Make sure your skin is clean and dry before you put that sensor on. And follow the manufacturer's instructions. They're there for a reason.
So prep work, basically.
Right. And don't be afraid to experiment a little bit. There are different types of adhesives, over patches. It's really all about finding what works for you.
It's almost like when you're getting ready to go on a big hike.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure you have the right gear
Yeah.
and that everything is packed properly and, secure before you set out.
Right. And just like any piece of equipment, your CGM needs a little bit of maintenance and, troubleshooting from time to time. So don't be afraid to reach out to customer support if you're really having some issues.
Yeah.
They can be surprisingly helpful.
This has been so helpful, I have to say. I feel like we've gone from being confused by those erratic readings to really understanding the role of hydration, critical thinking when we're looking at the data. It's been a good deep dive.
It has, and we've really just scratched the surface.
I know.
There's a lot more to learn.
Well, speaking of learning more, let's kind of start to wrap things up here. We've talked a lot about the technical aspects of CGM accuracy, but what about the mental and emotional impact?
Yeah.
How do these numbers actually affect how we feel?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah. I think it's a really important question that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, for sure.
So stay tuned, because in part 3 of this deep dive, we're going to go there. We're going to talk about the emotional side of CGM use and explore some ways to find balance and peace of mind in this data-driven world that we live in.
Can't wait.
Welcome back. We've covered so much ground already. We've deciphered the mysteries of interstitial fluid. We've learned how even something like taking a Tylenol can throw off our readings. But now it's time to talk about, honestly, something just as important, which is the mental and emotional side of living with the CGM.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the numbers.
Oh, I know.
And start feeling like every spike or every dip is a personal failure.
Right.
But we have to remember that data without context, that's just noise. It's not the whole story.
It's true. And honestly, those alarms, they can be so anxiety-provoking.
Yes.
Especially those middle-of-the-night ones that seem to come out of nowhere.
Right. And all that constant monitoring, it can lead to, I don't know if you've heard this term, hypervigilance, where you're just on edge all the time waiting for the next blood sugar roller coaster. It's exhausting.
Yeah, it's like having this voice in the back of your head that's constantly reminding you about your diabetes. Never lets you forget.
And that can be so draining, both mentally and emotionally. It's not surprising that a lot of people experience burnout and frustration, even guilt when it comes to managing their diabetes with a CGM.
So how do we break free from that data-driven anxiety? How do we find peace of mind in this world where we're just constantly bombarded with numbers?
I think it starts with remembering that your CGM, it's a tool, not a dictator.
Okay.
It's there to help you. It's not there to control your life. You are still in the driver's seat.
We've talked a lot about critical thinking and questioning those assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Looking beyond those individual data points, it seems like that applies to how we think about our own emotional well-being too.
Absolutely. Instead of obsessing over a single reading, ask yourself, what's the overall trend? How am I feeling physically? Is there anything else going on that could be affecting my blood sugar?
Right, so putting that data into perspective,
Yeah,
it's just one piece of the puzzle.
exactly. And you have to be kind to yourself. This is a journey, not a destination. There will be good days and bad days. You don't have to be perfect all the time.
So it's okay if I have those days where, my numbers aren't perfect. Maybe I enjoyed a treat or two. I don't have to beat myself up over it.
You're allowed to live your life.
Okay, good.
Guilt and deprivation, that just adds to the emotional burden.
It's about finding that sustainable approach
Yeah.
that honors both your physical and mental health.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay, I want to talk about social media for a minute.
Okay.
Because it's just such a big part of our lives. And, on one hand, it can be an incredible source of support and information.
Mm-hmm.
But it can also be this breeding ground for comparison
Oh, totally.
and self-criticism.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. You see those perfect CGM graphs online,
Ugh, yes.
and you start to feel like, oh, I'm not doing enough.
Like everyone else has it all figured out.
Right, and we're over here struggling. But remember, what you're seeing online, that's often just a carefully curated snapshot. It's not the whole picture.
So be mindful of the content you consume.
Yeah.
Everyone's journey is different,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And if you find yourself following accounts that are triggering negative feelings,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to unfollow. You can curate your online experience to be positive and uplifting.
It's like a digital detox.
Okay.
Sometimes that's exactly what you need. What about seeking professional support?
Mm-hmm.
When does it make sense to, talk to a therapist or a counselor?
If you're feeling overwhelmed by diabetes distress, if you're struggling with anxiety or depression, if you're just finding it hard to cope with the emotional demands of diabetes,
Yeah.
don't hesitate to reach out for help.
It's okay to ask for help,
It really is.
you know?
Therapists can give you the tools and strategies to manage stress, to build resilience, and to create a more positive relationship with your diabetes.
So I think we've covered a lot today. What would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners? What do we really want them to remember about the emotional side of using a CGM?
I think it really boils down to balance. You
Mhm.
want to embrace the power of technology, but also acknowledge its limitations.
Right.
You want to practice critical thinking, not just with the data, but also with your own thoughts and feelings. Be kind to yourself, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it.
Beautifully said. And one last thought to leave you with. In a world that's so obsessed with numbers, don't forget to listen to your body.
Mm-hmm.
Trust your intuition.
Yes.
Your CGM is a tool, but you are the expert on you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
Thanks for having me.